Today marked the start of a new chapter in the grand history of this chamber.
The challenge before us is great, but the time for action is now, and I will not let you down.
Hello, welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Leanne Caldwell, co-author of the Early Brief newsletter and anchor here at Washington Post Live. Today, I am joined by Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who is a top Republican of the Senate Commerce Committee, a member of the Judiciary Committee, and also up for re-election in Texas this year. Senator, thanks so much for joining us.
Leanne, good morning. Good to be with you.
So I want to start with some breaking news. We're going to talk a lot about social media, but first, just moments ago, the Justice Department announced a major antitrust lawsuit against Live Nation, the parent company of Ticketmaster, alleging its unrivaled power in the concert venue industry. Do you have any reaction to this lawsuit?
You know, I don't yet because I haven't examined the specifics of it. There's no doubt that Live Nation has significant market power, and there are lots of concerns about the impact on pricing. But I want to actually examine the lawsuit before proffering an opinion.
Fair enough. So I do want to turn now to kids and social media. You have a new bill with Democratic Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii. I've spoken to you about this bill recently, but what it does, just to give our audience a little bit of a primer, is one of the major things is it limits kids' use of social media before the age of 13. You have children. Why do you think that this is important?
Look, every parent I know worries to almost no end about the impact of phones on their kids. It's just a lot harder being a kid today than it was when you and I were kids. These phones, they are portals to everything horrible there is in the world, and there's so much pressure for kids to have the phones, and then there's so much negative content that is being pushed at children. Negative content on social media where you see bullying, where you see insecurity and anxiety and depression growing among our preteens and among our teens. You see body image issues with particularly young girls. You see suicidal ideation. You see substance abuse being pushed. And that doesn't even begin to touch the sexual predators and all the just evil that is on the phone. And so every single parent I know struggles with, what do you do? How do you protect your kid? And so this bill, Brian Schatz, a Democrat from Hawaii, he and I teamed up on this bill to give parents some important tools. And this bill really does three things. Number one, for kids under 13, it bans them from social media. It gives a rule for everyone. If you're under 13, you don't need to be on Facebook or Instagram. You don't need to be on social media. That there's so much pressure for young kids that it's a blanket ban. For kids under 17, they're allowed to be on social media, but it prohibits big tech from using algorithmic boosting, which is the means big tech does to collate their feed and to send messages that they know will be addictive to young teenagers. And that is prohibited in this bill for kids under 17. And the third thing it does is it incorporates a separate bill that I had with John Fetterman that is called the Eyes on the Board bill. And that bill requires schools that are receiving federal funds to block social media on campus so that when kids are at school, they can be listening to class, paying attention to the teacher, and not posting on social media.
Have you personally experienced in your household the challenges of social media and the impacts that it has on a family, on kids?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I've got two girls at home. They're 13 and 16, and we deal with these challenges every day. And it's interesting, the co-sponsors of this bill, that they're predominantly the younger senators. They're predominantly the senators in their 40s and 50s who have young kids at home, who have either preteens or teenagers at home and who've experienced just how challenging it is. It's interesting at the Senate, some of our older colleagues, they kind of scratch their head in bewilderment at what we're talking about. But when you're sitting there really worried about, okay, how do I protect my child? you could say, well, just take the phone away. But the challenge is no parent wants to ostracize their kid, to cut their kid off from their friends, from their social environment. And so you get trapped in a prisoner's dilemma where a lot of parents would love if no one was on it. But if every one of the classmates in 6th grade is on the same social media app, it becomes very difficult for your child to be the one child cut out of the social scene. It's why I think there's a real need for a legislation that sets a minimum floor.
You are a conservative, a small government conservative, but isn't this government overreach that the government is telling parents that their children cannot access social media, telling them what they cannot watch, cannot do?
You know, I don't think it is. There are all sorts of rules in government, particularly dealing with kids. You have a drinking age that you can't go in and buy a beer or buy liquor until you're 21. You have an age to get a driver's license, usually 16. You have an age to enlist in the military, 18. You have an age to vote, 18. It is commonplace in law to set standards for how to deal with minors, and that's a legitimate and important role of government.
You have another bill this week that you introduced with Senator Katie Britt regarding IVF. And what that bill does, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it prohibits states from receiving federal Medicaid funding if they restrict IVF in their state. I want to ask you, though, how does this square with your support of a personhood amendment regarding IVF, when sometimes there are many embryos that are created and not used?
Well, let me take that in two pieces. Let me talk about the bill first and what it does. The reason for the bill is IVF, number one, I think is incredible, is miraculous medical technology. And it has helped millions of parents have children who could not have otherwise have had children. We have every year in the United States, roughly 2% of all births in America come from IVF. There are over 8 million babies that have come from IVF. And in the wake several months ago of the Alabama Supreme Court decision, there's been an enormous amount of confusion and uncertainty and fear as parents in Alabama and elsewhere have worried and have been told that IVF might be taken away from them, that it might be limited, it might be prohibited by law. I think that is terrible. I was very glad in Alabama that the Alabama legislature very, very quickly came into session, passed a law, and clarified, no, IVF is fully protected in the state of Alabama. But there nonetheless remains considerable fear. And unfortunately, you've got more than a few Democrat partisans who are stoking that fear, who are using it as a political issue to say, if you don't vote for us, the big bad Republicans are going to take away IVF. That I believe is fundamentally false. I can tell you in the Senate, to the best of my knowledge, all 100 senators support IVF. Every one of us believes it's technology that should be protected by law. And so I approached Katie Britt, senator from Alabama, and I said, Katie, why don't we team up together and draft legislation, very simple legislation, straightforward legislation that protects IVF, that makes it ironclad. And this legislation says no state can ban IVF, no local government can ban IVF. And it's there to provide a protection for parents all across the country. It's a bill that was drafted, frankly, it should be a bill that is adopted 100-0. It should be a bipartisan bill. I don't know if the Democrats will oppose it or not. But if they oppose it, the only reason to oppose it is a very cynical reason, that they would rather campaign on the issue in November than actually pass a strong protection into federal law right now. But that's the purpose of the bill, and I think it's a very important bill that should unify everyone behind how important IVF is. Now, you asked about personhood. Go ahead.
Yep. No, go ahead. The personhood question, yes.
You asked about personhood. You know, it's interesting. There are several states that have adopted personhood laws. The state of Georgia has adopted a personhood law. The state of Alabama has adopted a personhood law. The state of Missouri has adopted a personhood law. In all three of those states, IVF is fully available, and the two are entirely compatible. What we tried to resolve in this bill is we tried to say, where is there complete bipartisan agreement? Where is everyone on the same page? And Katie and I came to the conclusion that what everyone agrees with is that IVF should be available, that parents should be able to access this incredible technology if they want to try to have a child or try to have a little boy or little girl to love, that they should have this technology. And so we deliberately drafted this legislation so that it was narrow and focused on the most important issue.
One of the tricky things with IVF, though, is what to do with unused embryos. Sometimes they are destroyed. Sometimes they are held in storage for years. Sometimes they are donated to science and research. What should what is done with embryos be legislated, and what do you think should be done with them?
Well, listen, this bill leaves that question to the states because different states resolve it differently. The state of Louisiana has a law, for example, IVF is available in Louisiana and it is used in Louisiana, but the state of Louisiana has a law that restricting the destruction of embryos. That was a question that in our view, you were not going to get partisan agreement. You weren't going to get 100-0. And so we said, let's focus on a narrow question everyone can agree with, which is that IVF must be available in all 50 states, that no state government, no local government can ban it. And different states can make different determinations as to what to do with unused embryos. That's a decision, that's a policy decision that I think the democratic process can resolve and can resolve consistent with the values of each state.
And I think that's some of the fear, any sort of prospect of criminalization or restrictions based on what to do with some of these embryos. But I want to move on. Texas has a strict abortion ban. There's a Supreme Court case that could be decided any day about mifepristone. Should women in Texas have access to mifepristone, and should they be allowed to travel across state lines for an abortion?
Well, listen, on the second question, there has long been a constitutional right to travel. The Supreme Court has upheld. Every one of us has a right to travel to another state. So I think as a legal question, that is clear and straightforward. On the question of abortion, Leanne, listen, this is an issue our country's really divided on. And people of good morals, people of good faith, look at this issue and come to very different conclusions. And it's an issue, those conclusions, many of them are very passionately held. They are emotional. Often they are intertwined with very personal experiences. And issues like this typically are resolved through the democratic process. And what the Supreme Court said in the Dobbs decision is that under our Constitution, when you have a policy issue on which the individual citizens disagree passionately, the right way to resolve that is through the democratic process. It's not 9 unelected judges in Washington, D.C. decreeing a rule for 330 million people. Rather, it's a process where every voter gets to have a say. And so the system we have now, we have 50 states, and you would not expect the people of Texas to adopt the same laws that the people of California do, or the people of New York or Illinois, or for that matter, Florida or Alabama or Nebraska. The beauty of 50 states is each state can reflect the values of their citizens. What that means right now is in bright blue states, in states like California, states like New York, we have essentially unlimited abortion on demand. That's where the voters are. That's the outcome the voters want in those states. In redder states, you've got more meaningful restrictions on when abortion is available and when it's not. And where exactly those lines are drawn varies state by state, depending upon the values and the mores of the citizens. I think that's democracy. That's the way our Constitution operates.
And where do you stand on mifepristone for women, families in Texas?
Well, I think that is a question that is going to be decided by the Supreme Court, and we'll see what the resolution is very shortly. We should have a decision within a month to a month and a half.
Yes. Speaking of the Supreme Court, I have to ask you about Supreme Court Justice Alito. There is now a second story about another flag that was flown outside of his vacation home that has also been tied to the January 6th attack on the Capitol and the Stop the Steal. I want to ask you, though, how can Americans have faith in the decision of the Supreme Court when also in the coming weeks there will be two decisions based on January 6th and Donald Trump. When there are two justices with perceived biases at the least about this issue, of course, Samuel Alito and these flags, but also Justice Thomas and his wife, Ginny. His wife, Ginny, of course, was texting Trump's then chief of staff, urging him to keep working to overturn the election. So how can Americans trust the outcome of the case with these instances?
Leanne, with all due respect, I think there's an enormous double standard that is playing out here, which is the Democrats in the Senate have mounted for several years a very concerted effort to try to smear the Supreme Court, to try to discredit the Supreme Court, and to try to intimidate the Supreme Court justices. That has included Chuck Schumer going to the steps of the Supreme Court, calling out the justices by name, threatening them, saying if they did not vote the way he wanted in upcoming cases, they would, quote, reap the whirlwind. You have justices who demonize, or rather you have senators who demonize justices. And the two in particular you mentioned, Clarence Thomas, there is a concerted effort to smear Justice Thomas, and now Justice Alito. Let me tell you, I know both of these justices personally. They are extraordinary jurists. They are men of impeccable character. They are some of the greatest Supreme Court justices ever to serve on the court. And the reason for this attack is the left is angry. They control the executive branch. They control the Senate, and they look at the Supreme Court as the one branch of government they don't control. It's why, if Chuck Schumer and the Democrats were to get one more Democrat senator, they would end the filibuster and they would pack the United States Supreme Court. They would grow it from 9 justices to 13 and add 4 left-wing justices. Why? Because they want hard left justices to impose their policy agenda through the courts. I think it is really disturbing, this effort to undermine the credibility of the court. And I would note, it also is manifested with very real threats of violence. We saw in the wake of the Dobbs decision, night after night, hundreds of angry, threatening protesters outside of the homes of Supreme Court justices, screaming at them, screaming at their family. And we saw Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, refuse to enforce federal law. It is a crime to protest at the home of a federal judge to try to influence the outcome of a case. And yet Merrick Garland refused to arrest anyone, order the DOJ not to arrest anyone. When questioned by the Senate, why does he pick and choose which law to follow? He refused to answer. And I would point out, those threats were not hypothetical. You had one deranged leftist from California, flew from Simi Valley to Bethesda, Maryland, with the intent of murdering Justice Brett Kavanaugh. He had duct tape and knives and guns, and thankfully was arrested just outside Justice Kavanaugh's home. So I think all of this is part of a broader effort to try to smear the court, and I think it's entirely one-sided, and it's a double standard that doesn't make sense.
There is definitely political violence on the right and on the left. But you do not think that Justice Alito should recuse himself from either of these cases?
Of course not. And understand, the Democrats calling for him to recuse himself, they'd call to recuse himself because he wore the wrong color shoelaces. They don't care what the grounds are. They just want people who will vote the way they want. If you look at the way the left looks at judges, it's very different from the way Republicans look at judges. I want judges who will follow the law. I want judges who will follow the Constitution and follow the law. I don't want judges who will impose the policy outcome I like. On the left, left, fundamentally, today's Democrat Party, I believe, does not believe in democracy because there are issues where the American people, the voters, aren't with them. And so they want judges to impose their policies from the bench. I think that's profoundly anti-democratic. And I think the much better way to reflect the will of the people is to let the people decide.
Speaking of democracy, in the 2024 election, will you accept the results of the election?
You know, I was on CNN last night, and I went round and round with Caitlin Collins on this as well. I have to say, Leanne, I do wonder if, like, a memo went out to everyone in the corporate media, ask every Republican this question, because everyone's getting the exact same. But hold on, can I ask you something, Leanne? Leanne, can I ask you something? So you walk down the halls of the Capitol all the time. Have you asked any Democrats that question?
so so I know that this is a typical response, but what happened in 2020 has not happened
Hold on
with
a
the
second.
Democratic Party.
Have you asked any
So,
Democrats that question? The answer is no. And I've never seen a
well,
Democrat answer that question. And listen, it
because they
is
have
utterly
not, there has not been political violence trying to overturn the election on behalf of the
there has
Democratic
not been
Party. So,
political
Senator, my
violence on the
question
left.
to you,
Leanne, did you miss the entire year 2020, the Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots that burned cities across this country, that firebombed police officers? Did you miss in Seattle the Chaz, the autonomous zone that they allowed to take over? Did you miss just a few weeks ago the anti-Semitic riots on campuses with leftists threatening Jewish students with violence? You say there's not violence
Senator,
from the
we
left.
have covered all of those things. We have covered all of those things, but I am
But then you
talking
can't
specifically
say
about
there
the
isn't violence on the left.
election.
You,
So
you,
do you
you
still
can't say
think that
there
Trump
isn't
won the
violence on the
2020
left.
election? Then? I'm not saying that, and that is not my question to you, because I'm asking about your specific action in 2020 and also what you will do in 2024. Do you still think that Trump won the election in 2020, and will you accept the results in 2024, Senator?
All right, let's take each of those questions. You asked, do I still think Trump won the election in 2020? I've never said that. What I've said is we had an election, we had a contested election. No, I've never said that. You can go back and look. I've never said that once. What I've said, I did object. And as you know, I get a speech on the Senate floor when I objected. And what I objected for, look, this is something I wrote about in a book I wrote called Justice Corrupted, How the Left Has Weaponized the Legal System. And I have an entire chapter in that book. It happens to be chapter 6. It's on January 6th, explaining what happened. And I go into the backdrop of that. Right after the election in November 2020, we saw a number of states using the excuse of COVID change their election laws and change the election laws in a way that dramatically increased the risks of voter fraud. They moved to things like universal mail-in balloting. They moved to things like allowing ballot harvesting. They moved to things like unattended ballot drop boxes. Every one of those are practices that significantly increase the risk of voter fraud. I think that was a very cynical effort by Democrats to take advantage of the pandemic to gain political advantage. Now, there were many allegations of voter fraud across the country coming out of that election. I struggled with, and I write about this at length in the book, I struggled with in November and December what the right response for Congress was in that circumstance. And the reason is I had two choices on January 6th. I either had to vote. We were going to have an objection to the election, so I either had to vote in favor of the objection or against the objection. And here was my dilemma. If I voted against the objection, that would be heard and understood by millions of Americans as my saying I thought voter fraud wasn't real, it didn't matter, it was not something we should be concerned with. And that's false. That's not what I believe. But the problem was, if I voted to certify, it was saying, that's if I voted to certify. If I voted not to certify, though, it is an utterly unprincipled position to say, well, my guy didn't win, so I'm not going to certify the election. I was not willing to do that. I believe in democracy. I believe in elections. And so simply sour grapes of saying the candidate I wanted to win didn't win, so I'm a no, that's unprincipled. And so both of the choices I had, I thought were terrible. As you know, before I was in the Senate, what I did for a living, I was a Supreme Court litigator. I argued cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And Supreme Court litigators, what you often do is you look to history and you look to precedent. And so I began researching and saying, well, has Congress ever faced this before? We have a country that's been around over 200 years. We ever faced this before? And as I looked at that, I began looking at the election of 1876, and I thought the election of 1876 was very relevant. That was the election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. And in that election, just like in 2020, there were very serious allegations of voter fraud in multiple states. And when it came to Congress, what did Congress do in 1876? It didn't throw its hands up and say, oh, we're powerless to do anything about it. We have to ignore the allegations of voter fraud. No, instead, what Congress did is it appointed an election commission. It consisted of 15 members, 5 House members, 5 senators, 5 Supreme Court justices. They examined the evidence, made a determination, and that resolved the election. So I proposed in 2020 we do the same thing. I think that was the best resolution for the fact pattern.
You did propose that, but also what was different in 2020 is that violent people had just ransacked the Capitol trying to stop the process. And after that, you still voted to object. So I guess that's why my question is, what will you do in 2024? It sounds like you are not committing at this point to accept the election results in 2024.
All right, so let me answer both of those questions. Number one, you are right. There were individuals who engaged in acts of violence on January 6th. And in my view, anyone who engages in an act of violence, anyone who assaults a police officer, should be prosecuted and should go to jail. And that includes whether you're a January 6th protester or whether you're an Antifa protester or whether you're an anti-Semitic protester on a college campus. All of them should be prosecuted and go to jail. Now, on the other hand, those who engage in peaceful free speech should not be persecuted. And I think the Biden administration has used January 6th as an excuse to target and persecute many people who were in Washington that day who did not engage in acts of violence. But I'll tell you, on January 6th, after those acts of violence occur, I and a number of other senators, we resolved, we said, we're not going to let their acts of violence change our responsibility to follow the Constitution and uphold the law, which is why when I put out my statement saying I was going to object, and I was going to object so we could have an emergency 10-day audit, appoint an election commission and examine the results, examine the evidence of voter fraud, 10 days would have been done before January 20th, so it would not have delayed the inauguration on January 20th. And 11 senators joined together in that joint statement. I think that by far would have been the best outcome. As for 2024, if the election is fair, absolutely, I will accept the results, of course. The reason it's a ridiculous gotcha is we have literally at every state legal systems in place to challenge the results of an election if there's fraud, if there's illegal conduct. And so
that's true.
You would be an idiot to say, well, if there's illegal conduct, we shouldn't challenge it. We should just let it go. We have election contests all the time in elections, from president to Senate to House member to dog catcher. And so the media game of swear on a stack of Bibles, you will accept the results no matter what, is kind of silly because nobody would do that. If there's illegality, you should want the law followed.
Of course. And in 2020, there were audits. There were more than 60 court cases, and there was not widespread fraud found that would have overturned the election. But Senator, your team is calling my team and saying that you need to get to the Senate floor to vote. So I'm going to have to leave it there. And hopefully you will come back again and we can chat some more. Thanks so much for joining us.
I look forward to it. Thanks, Leanne.
Thanks, Senator. And thank you for joining us today on Washington Post Live. You can watch this program and all of our other programs at WashingtonPostLive.com. Thanks so much.